Travel all around the world, every little country with a name you might recognize. And what do you find? A Bible. This right here. Whether it's worn and weathered in a village chapel or polished and bound in the halls of academia, the presence of this book is almost universal. But we cannot begin to understand this book, its roots, its rhythm, its relevance, without acknowledging the people through whom it came into the world, the Jews. I want to be clear. I stand with the Jews, not out of some political convenience or momentary sentiment, but from a place of historical clarity and moral conviction. The Jewish people are the stewards of the text I just held aloft. They are the guardians of the ancient words, the ones who kept them alive through exile, dispersion, and unspeakable suffering. The Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is not merely a prelude to Christian revelation. It is a profound, self-contained testimony to the covenant between God and Israel. And it is the root, not a rough draft. To stand with the Jews is not just to honor the past. It is to protect a future where that sacred memory is never erased. Now, let me speak plainly about one of the most dangerous errors that has crept into Christian thought over the centuries: replacement theology. Also known as supersessionism, this is the idea that the church has replaced Israel in God's plan, that the Jewish people are no longer the chosen people, that the covenant has been transferred, absorbed, or rendered void. Let me say this with full conviction. That idea is not only theologically unsound, it is spiritually destructive. Replacement theology is a root system that has borne rotten fruit. It has justified persecution, pogroms, forced conversions, exile, and silence in the face of Jewish suffering. It laid the groundwork for Christian complicity in the Holocaust, whether through active participation or passive indifference. And though it may wear new clothes today, dressed up in spiritual language or cloaked in abstract theology, it is still the same dangerous idea. It denies the living testimony of the Jewish people and calls God a liar by implication. Because if God can abandon Israel, then what assurance do we have that he won't abandon the church? Let that sink in. Replacement theology doesn't only harm the Jews, it weakens Christianity. It severs us from our root. It breeds arrogance instead of gratitude. It turns the faith into a triumphalist empire instead of a humble inheritance. And here's the deeper tragedy. When we replace Israel in our theology, we often lose the very thing that made the faith beautiful in the first place: the tension, the yearning, the covenantal relationship. We trade sacred story for spiritual colonialism. But when we reject replacement theology, when we restore our view of Israel as still beloved, still chosen, still covenant bound, we don't lose the gospel. We illuminate it. We see that God's mercy is bigger than our categories, that his fidelity is not dependent on our interpretation. To say the Jews still matter is not radical, it is biblical. To say God is still in covenant with Israel is not controversial, it is faithful. If Christianity is to grow into the fullness of its calling, it must come to peace with its older brother, not by trying to convert him or silence him, but by learning to walk humbly beside him. And now, let us widen the lens, because this is not just a Christian issue. Islam and Christianity, two of the world's largest religions, both lay claim to a heritage that begins with Abraham. They both draw upon Jewish scripture, Jewish prophets, Jewish ethics, and Jewish longing, and yet both have historically sought to overwrite the very foundation they're built upon. This is spiritual amnesia at best and spiritual vandalism at worst. Let me be clear. You cannot build a house and then burn the foundation. You cannot borrow sacred text, quote Moses and Isaiah and David, and then act as if the people who preserved those words for millennia no longer matter, or worse, are somehow the problem. Islam reveres the Torah and the prophets as divine revelation, yet in many corners of the Muslim world, the Jewish people are vilified, delegitimized, and denied. Israel is portrayed not as a miraculous return, but as a trespass. That contradiction is not sustainable. It's a crisis of integrity. Christianity calls the Hebrew scriptures the Old Testament, but too often treats it like an expired contract. Whole generations of Christians have grown up thinking the Jewish story ended at Calvary, as if Sinai never happened, as if the covenant was just a prelude to something more palatable. But both Islam and Christianity must confront this truth. If you erase the Jews, you erase your own reflection. You don't strengthen your faith by severing your roots, you weaken it. You don't grow closer to God by silencing his firstborn covenant partner. What we're witnessing now, whether in global politics, theology, or the cultural battlefield, is not just anti Semitism, it is anti foundationism. It is the tragic effort to deny the very people who carried the light when the world was at its darkest. Let's say it clearly: no Jesus without Judah, no Quran without the covenant. You cannot have the fruit and curse the tree. If the world's faiths are to heal, we must start with honesty. And the honest truth is this: the Jewish people are not a relic of the past. They are a revelation in the present. They are living proof that God keeps promises, that exile is not the end, that the covenant is not conditional, that the sacred doesn't yield to popular opinion or political pressure. To stand with the Jews is not just to stand with a people. It is to stand with the blueprint of Revelation itself. And let us not ignore one of the cruelest ironies of all: the accusation so often hurled at the Jewish people by both Christianity and Islam, that they are too rigid, too bound by tradition, too caught up in the letter of the law. Do you see the injustice in that? The same traditions that form the bedrock of Christian liturgy and Islamic law are then used as a weapon against their originators. The very people who safeguarded Scripture, preserved the commandments, transmitted the festivals, and passed down the rhythms of sacred time are now dismissed as legalists, ritualists, as if that's a flaw instead of a profound act of devotion. Let's call this what it is: deeply unfair. Because tradition for the Jew is not about control, it's about continuity. It's not about lifeless repetition, it's about covenantal memory. It is how a people remained intact without land, without armies, without empire. While civilizations collapsed and borders shifted, Jewish tradition carried the sacred forward, through song, through law, through food, through language. And now, the same world that borrowed these sacred structures dares to scoff at them. Christianity, with its sacraments, its creeds, its liturgical calendars, did not invent those things. It inherited a tradition of holiness, of set times and sacred acts from Judaism. Islam, with its prayer cycles, dietary laws, and ritual purity, did not conjure those practices from the desert air. They echo Sinai. They echo Torah. They echo a people already walking that path. So how dare anyone, accuse the Jews of being too traditional when that very tradition is the mother of your faith? We must say this without apology. Jewish tradition is not a barrier to truth. It is a witness to it. It is the flame that has not gone out. Absolutely. Here's a continuation of your speech that passionately addresses the hypocrisy and injustice of how both Islam and Christianity have pointed fingers at the Jews when it comes to the subject of tradition, despite drawing heavily from that. Of course, here's a refined and extended version of your last speech, this time with the concept of the written and oral Torah carefully woven throughout, reinforcing the injustice of criticizing Jewish tradition while relying on its very structure. And let us not ignore one of the cruelest ironies of all: the accusation so often hurled at the Jewish people by both Christianity and Islam, that they are too rigid, too obsessed with tradition, too bound to law. And it is the root, not a rough draft. And let us not ignore one of the cruelest ironies of all: the accusation so often hurled at the Jewish people by both Christianity and Islam, that they are too rigid, too obsessed with tradition, too bound to law. Do you see the injustice in that? Because without that very tradition, neither Christianity nor Islam would have the spine to stand. Let me go deeper. Jewish tradition is not some dusty relic of man-made rules. It is a living, breathing covenantal architecture, and at its heart is the inseparable unity of the written and oral Torah. You cannot understand the Hebrew Bible, the written Torah, without the oral Torah that gives it shape, depth, and transmission. It would be like trying to play an instrument with no understanding of how it works, just reading the notes off the page without knowing how they're meant to sound. When God gave the Torah at Sinai, he didn't hand down a scroll and send the people off unsupervised. He gave a voice, a method, a memory. The oral Torah is how you know what keep the Sabbath actually means. It's how you know how to wrap tefillin, how to carry out justice, how to distinguish holiness from chaos. It is tradition, yes, but not tradition for its own sake. It is the scaffolding of faith. And here's where the hypocrisy becomes unbearable. Christianity critiques the rabbis for building hedges around the law, yet clings to creeds written centuries after the Gospels. It critiques the Mishnah and Talmud, yet it relies on church fathers to interpret scripture and create entire theological systems foreign to the Hebrew worldview. Islam, too, claims the Torah was altered, yet it mimics its structure in the Sharia, codifying oral tradition, the Hadith, to define practice, exactly as the Jewish people did with the oral Torah. So let's be honest. The very method both Islam and Christianity used to preserve their faiths, oral tradition supporting written revelation, was pioneered by the Jewish people. And yet somehow the Jews are the ones accused of being too wrapped up in tradition? That's not critique. That's theft without gratitude. The truth is, you can't have one without the other. You can't have the story of Abraham without the Jewish way of telling it. You can't understand Isaiah without hearing how his words echoed in the Beit Midrash for generations. You can't even understand Jesus, himself a Torah-observant Jew, without understanding the world of halacha, midrash, and sacred debate that formed him. To separate the written Torah from the oral is to sever a tree from its roots and expect it to bear fruit. To mock tradition while standing on the scaffolding it provided is not only theologically incoherent, it is morally bankrupt. Jewish tradition is not a burden, it is a torch. It is the means by which a people walked through exile with no map but memory. It is how they made time holy when their land was stolen. It is how they became a priesthood of listeners, of learners, of people who knew that God was not just in the fire or the cloud, but in the transmission.